This week's episode is in two parts, the first of which is a conversation with Rachel and Tyler, authors of the Verbena and Order of Hermes sections respectively in Lore of the Traditions, followed by an interview with Thrax Theanos, who wrote the Society of Ether section. In other news, I'm finishing my draft for the next executive producer publication, which I'm tentatively titling Realms Uncharted Sundown Palace, which outlines a realm containing a massive shared domain inspired by an off comment in her Discord. If you're an executive producer, there will be a link to that in the Discord and on the Patreon in the coming weeks. For everyone else, that'll be out in Storyteller's Vault in due time. Also, thanks to everyone who's backed Lore of the Traditions. That Kickstarter is going well so far. Link is in the show notes. Also, thanks to everyone who mentioned Lore of the Factions being a book they wanted in the Kickstarter comments, based on the discussion we had with the authors in the last episode. And with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson, and today we are continuing our series of Let's Talk to People Who Wrote About Traditions with Rachel, who is a recurring Onyx Path writer, games freelancer, Duchess, also possibly a Huguenot. Rachel wrote the Verbena section as well as the introductory fiction, was it?
Yes, I did.
Awesome. And also joining me is Tyler, founder and owner of Vorpal Tales, operator of probably more OPP live plays than you can shake a stick at, and someone who is also getting rich at the rate of $0 per day doing a multimedia RPG empire. Tyler, you took care of the Order of Hermes?
Correct.
Awesome. So let's get into it. Rachel, what is your involvement with Mage the Ascension? How did you get involved in the line, and how did you get involved being a professional writer for it?
So I've been writing for Onyx Path off and on for a couple years now. My first assignment was in the Dark Ages Companion, and I got into Mage when I ended up doing a live play with Travis Legg, who was the producer for some of the Mage stuff, and I guess I have impressed him because he keeps giving me Mage work.
How about you, Tyler?
Through Rachel, actually. I had contemplated it for a long time, but it was Rachel who encouraged me to go for it. And since then, I've branched out to other Onyx Path products. So thank you, Rachel.
What previous experience did you have with Mage the Ascension as players?
Playing in Tyler's game.
Oh, that's convenient.
I've been playing Mage since it came out. That was one of the first RPGs I ever bought that was not Dungeons & Dragons.
Okay, so we're talking
on and off. Yeah, we're talking 1E.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yep.
And I hope you brought that 1E sensibility to your writing. Rachel, do you just want to give us an outline kind of who the Verbena are in your mind and what you think their biggest challenge as a tradition was in 2021?
When I think of the Verbena, I think mostly of traditional Wicca and neo-pagan practices. And so that's really the traditions that I drew on for inspiration. But then I also wanted to be very respectful of not only Wicca as a religion that real people practice and neo-paganism, as a religion that real people practice, but also the early Verbena stuff is very, very Eurocentric. And in Wiccan spaces and neo-pagan spaces, there's a lot of conversations about the appropriate role for non-European traditions. And there's discussions about, is this practice open or closed? And so I wanted to write about that also. And so in my part, the Verbena history, there's this internal tension where you've got Indigenous and Aboriginal practitioners who, for whatever reason, decided not to go with the Dream Speakers because they feel more comfortable in, this very Earth-centric belief system and paradigm, and now they're challenging the Druids and the Greco-Roman priestesses and hey, our traditions and our paradigms are just as good as yours, so why aren't we given leadership?
When you were looking at those non-European traditions lowercase t, what to you was the paradigmatic or political through line that drew it together? Can you give us an example of a non-European group that rests comfortably within the Verbena?
I can't because I didn't have that much of a word count. So I just wanted to say that there are these groups of people who are part of the Verbena who are not part of the neo-pagan druidic practice, and they are still asking, to be accepted as equals and respected.
So integrating a wider variety of practices into the tradition in 2021 is kind of a big focus for you. Were there any other that came to mind?
So there is some very weird transphobia that pops up in witchcraft spaces. And I really wanted to push back on that. And there are a couple points in the book where I write explicitly Verbena don't care what body you were born with. It depends on the energies that you surround yourself, that you go out into the world every day. So if you, dress like a woman and do your hair like a woman, then it doesn't matter what your body looks like. What matters is that you are wrapping yourself up in feminine energy. So as far as the Verbena are concerned, you are a woman.
And I feel like Mage as a game runs into, at minimum, a complicated relationship with the social gender binary in a world where, one, you have the idea of an avatar. There could be a distinct piece of you that has different ideas about who you should be that is also kind of inside of you. And also when you have access to the sphere of life. Like, it seems hard to have any sort of like gender essentialism at that point, but that's just me opining as an outsider who life 5. That's real thorough there.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I really wanted to emphasize, Verbena will accept you as you are. They are 100% trans rights.
What do you consider then to be some of the internal questions that the Verbena are maybe fighting over internally? Like in a lot of previous editions, there was always some group that they weren't necessarily sure about, or there was a division between contemporary and historical practitioners about whether or not Technobena can exist as a thing. Do you feel that there are any big internal questions that the Verbena is still open for consideration within the tradition?
There's a lot of room to explore what the old ways means for someone who feels the call to practice as a Verbena, but lives nothing like what her ancestors lived like. So, for me, if I want to bake bread from scratch, I go to the grocery store and I buy flour and I buy yeast. And for someone else, that is not how you bake bread from scratch. You start the steps way sooner. And so I really wanted to explore, all right, you've got these new urban Verbena who are practicing out of, an apartment and a patio garden. And so how are they treated by someone who has access to groves and big gardens? And what role does tradition have in each of these mages' different practice? Because the Verbena are very, very much about the old ways. Okay, that's cool, but now what about when someone wants to take a different viewpoint on what honoring the old ways means? And so that was some tension that I had a lot of fun writing.
Does anyone in the Verbena use the insult urbana to apply to their possibly urban counterparts? Or is that something I can explore in a Storyteller Vault supplement?
Yeah, hang on, I gotta go send Travis a quick email about something. No, I had a lot of fun with this project. I'll probably have more to say in a couple questions, but yeah.
So Tyler, you had as a newish mage writer, they gave you the easiest tradition to cover that had the least history and least controversy, the Order of Hermes. So, what is the 2021 Order of Hermes to you, and what was that like tackling it?
The biggest issue, I think, bringing it into M20 was, in 2 words, getting woke, because the Order of Hermes is the definition of old rich white guys, if there is one in Mage. So doing that with only a few thousand words was a challenge, but I tried to convey the sense of it, the feeling, more than just the words, because of word count. But pulling them into the future, because in previous supplements, especially in Revised, they were forced to change from the writer's perspective, but they weren't forced to compromise or upend their core values. And so I tried to tackle that, where this is a world where you can't be black and white anymore.
So to you, one of the questions is, historically, the Order of Hermes in their magic has embraced nuance, but in their worldview has not. And you thought it was kind of vital to integrate that. What does that actually look like?
I broke that down into 3 separate parts. One, I tried to focus more on the smaller houses and less on the big grand houses that is usually gets all of the limelight. I focused a lot on how they need to change how they interact, not just with the crafts, especially the ones that they've co-opted, some might say white saviored, but also the technocracy. The 2 biggest enemies maybe shouldn't shoot first and talk never anymore. And then the third part was I focused all of my primary characters, including my new favorite one, on those smaller houses, or at least smaller than, the big 3.
Who do you consider to be the big 3 at this point?
Flambeau, Bonasagus, and Fortuné, probably.
Okay. When you were talking about changing to modernity, I feel like of houses, Quasitor and Titulus would have to do a lot of self-reflection, to put it mildly.
Yes.
So you were saying new characters that you brought to the front, new houses. What are some of those elements?
I brought to the fore I don't think replacement's the right word, but a new updated primary character, at least from the point of view of Phil Brucato, and I got to work with him on the characters, so that was pretty enjoyable. That's actually from House Shea. Maestra Ioka Sophia Bani Shea as a new finger quotes primary character was really cool to add and helped adjust the paradigm a lot, I think, because she's very different than what came before her, even her mentor.
Yeah,
Who may or may not be as dead as we think.
So it looks like you got to write up significantly, possibly the backstory of the person that is currently on the cover of Rich Bastard's Guide to Magic.
Yes. Absolutely my favorite part of the whole thing.
Yeah, it's kind of disappointing that like the only information we got about her starts in like the art of Mage.
Yes.
Like on one end of the spectrum you have Vampire, where like this book details every kindred in Indiana, and on the other side we have Mage, where it's like they're a signature character. Do they have a name? Probably.
Cool picture.
Yeah, yeah, we got a cool ass picture in a couple of spots. So we've kind of laid it down the basic questions. Rachel, what was a bit of lore you were most pleased to add? And on the flip side of that, was there anything you were particularly pleased to kind of get rid of?
Reading through the older tradition books, there is a character who is one of the lead title characters for the Verbena. She's a very powerful witch named Chimeria, and in the revised tradition book, not only is she pregnant, but she ends up killing the father of her baby as part of a human sacrifice to revitalize the dying node on the farm that they all live on, which is pretty brutal, but also very Verbena. And so, I was checking the publication date, and I'm like, oh wow, when Lore of the Tradition comes out, her baby will be 18 years old. So I had a lot of fun figuring out, all right, who is this person and how does she feel about what her mom did to her dad, and how can she show up in really cool stories? And so other than that, I really approached it as I wanted to add to the Verbena. I did not really want to take anything away. Oh, no, there is one thing I took away. There is Freedom Estates is mentioned in the revised tradition book. It has ties to neo-Nazis, and I'm like, nope, they're gone. It's a wasteland now.
Where is this?
Yeah, in the revised tradition book, it's just mentioned very briefly that, and I think the intent was to sort of set up internal conflict between the Verbena about like, hey, there's this neo-Nazi compound who are doing Verbena magic, and I'm like, not anymore, they're not, they're gone.
Okay, got it. We continue the process of getting rid of the Nazis, which again, it's the world of darkness, and they seem to be better at getting rid of their white supremacists than our world, so at what point is it dark? Was there anything else that you were pleased to be able to insert? Maybe an omission that you thought should have been there sooner, or a correction or anything like that? And the answer may quite simply be no.
I would have loved to have had double the word count that I was given, because there's so much cool stuff to explore, and I had to be really, really economical with what I chose to write about and what I chose to say. What else did I enjoy?
Do we finally get a character sheet for Lilith?
No.
Okay, I can hope.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I tend to think of Lilith as being true fae.
I can certainly get behind that. I am fond of stating that Revelations of the Dark Mother is one of the best mage books in Vampire, so I can certainly get behind that.
I am running a Sabbat game, and one of my players just bought a copy of that for reasons.
Tyler, was there any bit of lore that you felt very pleased to add, or alternatively anything you were glad to kind of get rid of?
I enjoyed adding some more modern lore about various ways. I don't know if you'd call it lore or possibilities about how the Order of Hermes could get along with the technocracy, even temporarily if necessary. That was interesting to try to figure out. What would make those two work together? How bad would it have to be? And the answer is pretty bad. As far as things I tossed out, the old structure, I mean, it's kind of tossed out already, but they never officially tossed it out, which was the old structure of how things were set up in Horizon. or in the spiritual version of Doistep. It was kind of structured like a bit of indentured servitude and a bit of, unless you're like us, you have to go to the dorms on the other side of campus. So I wiped all that out.
You had made mention that you had spent some word count on some of the lesser known traditions. Can you give us an example of one that got maybe some attention that in previous edition didn't get much love, like Kriamon or Skiopos or Gerbaton? Any of, I think, the 24 that were like introduced and revised but never got any words?
Yes, Marinita gets a little bit of attention. Shay gets a decent amount of attention. Goma, I gave specific attention to the House of Nagoma. I also touched on how that could interact with the craft.
Does your book allow for there to still be, for instance, a House Honglei and a House Nagoma within the Hermetics, while there is also a larger craft running around out there?
Yes, I have wonders specifically for Nagoma and House Honglei in there for that particular reason, and I address pretty much that directly in the Unlikely Allies section under Disparate Alliance, what each thinks of the other and how they might be able to come together, especially Hermes, and how that would work, trying to fix that relationship.
So what is it like when a craft is seemingly divided? Like, for instance, for either Honglei or Nagoma or Solificati, what is that view, just as an example of how they look at each other?
The craft Nagoma does not look down on House Nagoma members because they did what they had to do to survive at the time, but they do look down on the Order as a whole because it was more of a white savior. What can you do for us? Now get in the corner. They didn't really give them any of their own. They don't have equal representation of the big houses. They were just jammed in alongside everything else. And we came to that conclusion working with some other people working on other projects that had a lot of insight on the crafts. Honglei, that's different. They don't recognize each other regardless. If you're House Honglei, Craft Honglei doesn't think you exist because you're a traitor. You quit. Whereas House Honglei actually wants to bridge the gap and try to make amends for what happened. So very different approaches for those two.
I'm most impressed by the existence of diplomatic hermetics. That's a relatively new thing to the canon.
Yes.
And you bring up an interesting point with the unlikely alliances. Rachel, was there any unlikely alliance that you introduced, maybe relations with the technocracy or a disparate group that you think readers would be particularly interested in as pertains to the Verbena?
Oh, yeah, I do hint that sometimes Verbena end up, because they are totally fine with blood magic, sometimes they end up hanging out with Shimisei Kuldunic sorcerers. Nobody talks about it.
You heard it here first, folks. Would you please define every word in that sentence now, please?
Yeah, so the Shimisei are one of the 13 clans in vampires. They're the ones with vicissitude that everybody has their own ways on pronouncing it, because, like, half your listeners screamed that I'm pronouncing it wrong. So they have their own special branch of blood magic, and it never really gets as much focus as vicissitude, but it is Kuldunic sorcery, and it is very much tied to elementalism and the land and sort of based off of Eastern European witchcraft. And so for me, it seems like, yeah, they would have more than a little bit in common. And so I can definitely see a Verbena and a Shimisei sort of encountering each other in the same sacred grove on a particular full moon.
Being very polite to one another?
Yes.
Oh man, I didn't even know that was an option. When they're like unlikely alliances, I could have been like, fuck you, Celestial Chorus, big fan of mummies. Deal with it, Travis.
Man.
And what was it like doing that? Did you just need to make sure that it tied to V20?
I just wrote a paragraph about how the Verbena look at vampires. They think thaumaturgy is pretty wasteful, so they are not fans of the Tremere, but there's this other vampiric blood magic practice where they're like, okay, that's cool.
That's nice. Were there any new characters that you got to introduce that you are particularly pleased by or were glad to write?
Yeah, I got to write Chimera's daughter, Kaya Shula Fairmont. So she's just this teenage hitchhiker who could, I really like the idea your coterie just comes across this teenager who Turns out she's from a very powerful witch's lineage, and I think she might be a cool addition to a mage campaign. Another thing that I sort of enjoyed in the Future Fates part was, so you've got the Ascension Warrior, who might be a reincarnation of Halo Teomim. If that's true, then possibly his partner Eloine reincarnated at some point. Where is she? That's interesting. Where are her children? So I don't really answer any of those questions, but I just sort of bring them up as something that storytellers can pick up and run with if they like.
Tyler, how about you?
Every character I introduced I thought was cool. One of them's kind of an update. The other two are brand new. Master Ioka, of course, who got fully fleshed out as the, in a roundabout way, heir apparent to Porthos, who he sort of kind of picked. I was able to find references all the way back to 1E, like you said, nothing concrete, but all the way back to 1E, she exists to piece together the history. I also learned from Phil where the name came from, which was fascinating. It's actually a poet, Ioka Okawa, who is a translation of the name means I want to be respected in Nigerian Esan. I did not know that, so that was interesting to see how he comes up with names. And you can see how she looks by her pictures, but of course she's a hermetic, so she's actually pretty old. She's in her mid-50s, pushing 60s. Fantastically intelligent, and exists entirely to uncover the truth of what happened to Porthos and why.
When you say heir, is that not necessarily as Primus, but kind of as chief instigator?
Yep.
Okay.
The face of mage drama, the way Porthos used to be. Yep.
Got it. Do you posit a new Primus?
I do not. I leave that up to the storytellers because that could go lots of ways. I focus more on leadership of individual houses or even just unique new masters. I also redid Callisti of House Chaos, so they got a little love. And then I created a new master for Kriamon, who is non-binary, because I haven't seen one of those yet. Specifically, their magic works around that.
So as you mentioned, the depiction on page 44 of Order of Hermes, House Shea, that is Ioka, correct? Like, or
Yes.
at least that is the inspiration, if not the same person. Yeah. So I find it interesting that like House Shea has like hit above its weight continually throughout Mage history, especially providing us the Primus and revised in the form of Ishak ibn Thoth, who was generally recognized as the number 3 pick in the Mage the Podcast, who would be the best Archmaster to date episode. So that's good to know.
I could get behind that.
Yeah. Rachel, do you opine on who the Primus of the Verbena is at current?
I take the viewpoint that the Verbena are very, very decentralized, and they are not quite as politically driven as the Hermetics. So anyone who wants to represent the Verbena sees it as more of a burden. Like, got stuff to do here, guys. This tea won't brew itself. Fine, I'll go to the meeting.
The Primi give us a snapshot of what the writers think the mix is of the traditions as well as the politics of the council. So I'm always curious to see what people posit as being the face of a group. Sometimes it is strictly a political appointment, other times it is well respected. It is not uncommon for the most potent person within the tradition to not be the Primus and to be an independent actor in the world otherwise. And it's been interesting hearing kind of the mix that people present, either holding over from what was established in previous editions or coming up with something new. Was there a favorite bit of magic that you got to add, maybe in terms of a paradigm or a practice or a rote, Tyler?
Oh yeah, I enjoyed bringing into M20 all of the nuance of the Order of Hermes, true naming and how it works, new mechanics for that, as well as R's and foci specific to the Hermetics, and also a couple new secondary skills such as Enochian and Unbrewed protocols that we used to have in older versions. All of that was real fun for me. Lots of juicy, fun new esoteric Hermetic things to spend all kinds of time on in a session.
Do you have one example that you were particularly pleased with or you think people would be interested in?
True naming. I broke it down with an example, and I found that to be very interesting how in the end it ends up being a ridiculous pile of nonsense, but every part actually has a specific meaning. So the true name in the example is Gabriel Sarah Catherine Everett Miller Hargrave Benny Chaos Blackbird the Kaliak Dirge of the Winter Court Protector of the Vega Trickster Extraordinaire in Caligni Abditus Larmo Giltrip Vestruvaum Nilit Lur. And I break down exactly why. That was fun.
So does it still have the thing where you need like 12 nonsense syllables in there, or?
That is yep, that was what that whole last section was.
It was remarkably similar to my Facebook password, which is why I was a little bit concerned at first, but yeah. Rachel, was there anything magic-wise that you were pleased to introduce? Maybe a wonder or even a place or something like that?
Yeah, this is going to make Tyler laugh a bit. Girthy black candles. So what I wanted to do when writing the Verbena was make them more inclusive, and that includes like not just neo-pagan practices, but also like the Abrahamic religions. And so this is essentially a prayer candle, like that you see in certain botanicas. And so it's a way to communicate with spirits and ghosts, but I also appreciate it because it gave me a chance to be like, and sometimes you can have a Jewish or Muslim or Christian verbena. Why not?
If you had a couple thousand words to add, Rachel, what would you have wanted to include if you could?
I would have loved just to expand every section that I wrote. I would have loved to make the history longer, to add in more characters, and to be able to say more about them. It would have been really, really cool if I could have done a lot more about how the Verbena reacted to the changing history. And so Verbena being very much into witchcraft, very much, not necessarily feminine centric, but incorporates the sacred feminine than more mainstream religions, that would empower women in a time which women weren't supposed to be empowered. And I really would have loved the word count to explore that a little bit more. I would have loved to be able to reach out and talk about the non-European, the non-Celtic, non-Greco-Roman practices, because I just sort of have to say that's what they are, and I would have loved to give a little paragraph or two to a dozen different paradigms. That would have been a lot of fun.
How about you, Tyler? If you had more word, where would that have gone?
Paradigm thing is definitely the same for me. I could have exposited for many pages on hermetic practices and esotericism and how and why it covers so many different ways of doing magic from across the world. And I also could have used several thousand more words to exposit on how it really is the Order of Hermes does really belong to the younger mages, because most of the older are gone, lost, or mad, and what that really means for the people who are in charge now do not think or act at all like their predecessors did.
If you were tapped for another book for 20th anniversary edition, what would you want it to be, and what would you want to add to it?
I really, really love the idea of future fates, and I had a lot of fun writing my future fates, and that the whole idea of them being in a book is what inspired the introductory fiction, because it's a virtual adept who sneaks into Concordia, but they find themselves at the nexus of all possible Concordias, and so that was distinctly inspired by future fates, and so I would love a book. It's nothing but future fates.
Oh, interesting. As in just events in Mage history that could have turned out differently, or taking what we had in revised and just saying and projecting it forward in 4 or 5 different ways, or some blend of the two.
Some blend of the two. Just explore alternate futures. What if different ways for the Ascension War to fall out, and just really go into detail about, how a technocratic victory changes the world, how a technocratic defeat changes the world. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
And we can all do it without violating the remit of M20 is not allowed to have meta plot. So here to that.
Yeah.
Tyler, is there any other dream mage project that you would like to participate in?
I can think of 3, actually. One would be the dreamiest of dreams, the way books have to work nowadays, but an individual book for each tradition would be awesome, like they used to have, because then we would get those extra 50,000 words. The other 2, possibly more realistic, though, would be I'd love another Umbral book, a Book of the Umbra, where it describes going into the other dimensions and how that would work. And I know the dossier exists, but a book specifically about technocracy story hooks and adventures would be fun.
Nice. And hopefully we can see if those happen. Mage feels like it's in a weird position right now because we still have books coming out but there is no mention of M5 anywhere on the horizon. So we seem to be in this place where for the next couple of years, the game is ours, in the sense that we are people who are actively participating in the greater Mage community. We run live plays or other media or write things for the Storyteller Vault. So we kind of get that ability. It will never have the imprimatur of Paradox, but it's not going to be co-opted anytime soon, which I like. So hopefully some of these projects in some form can make it to the light of day. Any other comments that you'd like to add about working on it, or any other things that came up in the writing process that you want to share?
This was a real fun job. I enjoyed doing all the research. It was a lot of fun, and I hope that people read this section and they get inspired for cool ideas for Verbena characters that they can make, or if you're a storyteller, cool plot lines that you can use that incorporate the Verbena. Because if you've done that, then I've done my job.
I have no doubt that is what's going to happen.
Thank you.
Tyler, anything for you?
The same. I hope the section on the Order of Hermes sparks the imaginations of storytellers to write stories, if not exclusively about them, but definitely involving their unique way of doing magic. And also, to the readers who read it and you read the history section, just remember the word count. We had to squish it dramatically.
Rachel and Tyler, thank you so much for joining. Rachel, is there a project you'd like to shout out or where we can find you? But if people are interested in knowing what you're up to, where can they do that?
You can find me, Stolen Fires, pretty much everywhere on the internet. That includes Twitter, Twitch, and Instagram. And I am perennially attached to Vorpal Tales. I will be doing something there at some point. I'm currently, at the time of recording, running a Sabbat game. And then down the horizon, there will be a Vampire the Requiem Belial's Brood game. And at some point, I will also be running Horror on the Orient Express. So I'm looking forward to all of that.
Oh, the Call of Cthulhu version? Or?
Yes.
Nice.
Yes, Call of Cthulhu.
Awesome. And Tyler, how about you?
I'm not, I was going to say currently working on, but just turned in my work for They Came from the Cyclops Cave. That's going to be awesome. It'll be a lot farther along by the time this airs. People should check that out when they can, the Kickstarter. And in the fall and early winter on the show that Rachel was mentioning, we will be playing Mage 20th Technocracy, Mage 20th Traditions, and Wraith the Oblivion. So 20th anniversary fans, lots going on there.
Awesome. I look forward to hopefully talking to both of you again when those projects are out into the world so we can go, hey, people, listen to this stuff. Rachel and Tyler, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. It was fun.
Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And our next guest today, as we discuss lore of the traditions, is Theanos Thrax. And they are the author of the Society of Ether section. Theanos, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Glad to be here, Terry.
And I'm glad to have you as we close in on almost all of the authors. So kind of before you were tapped to write this, how did you get into Mage the Ascension?
Now, I don't remember which title it was, but my first Mage purchase would have been second edition, 1995 into 1996. And I remember the day at the bookstore, and it was, I somehow managed to never play Vampire the Masquerade until the very late 90s. But my first World of Darkness purchase was some werewolf stuff, and then on from there to Mage, and then from Mage to Changeling. And somehow I just missed the Vampire bandwagon altogether till years later. So it is not a game, unfortunately, that I have had a whole lot of table time with, predominantly because I forget who said this, but Mage is the thinking gamer's game. And it is a lot more involved than your casual weekly gaming group is often able to commit to. And so it's a world that I got to play, enjoyed playing, enjoyed reading a lot more than I ever got to play it, I think is the best way to frame that.
That is my relationship with Dungeons and Dragons. I have encyclopedic knowledge of Planescape, which I have never played. So yeah, that I certainly get. So you were drawn in by the Big Purple sometime around second edition. You did some playing. What was it like to be tapped to write for Lore of the Traditions? Have you done other RPG dev work, or otherwise, how do you think you got onto the radar as someone to write Mage stuff?
With the inclusion of the Mage book and another Onyx Path upcoming piece for the Aberrant line, those are my first forays into writing for gaming books. I have written extensively for my own games. I have been a for-hire game master and storyteller, so I have written for other people's campaigns, but nothing that has gone to print either through self-publishing or through an actual imprint. However, the bucket list for me and how it came about was there was an open call for authors for the Aberrant product, and I sort of arbitrarily and possibly while drunk sent in a submission for that because it occurred to me that if I become a published author in game stuff, I have technically, or will have technically, I think, been at least a contributing author to every category of the Dewey Decimal, which was that was a benchmark for me, like milestone before I die. That'd be cool. So it was something that I wanted to do. Aberrant was a great inroad. It went really well. Travis also oversaw that project, and so I had a really good time on that. And then I got an email saying, "Hey, would you be interested in a chapter in a Mage book?" At which point I read the screen several more times to make sure that I was that I was understanding what I was reading correctly, because the answer, of course, is a resounding yes, followed immediately by existential dread.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the thing that kept recurring to me while looking at this project is we were, I believe, all given roughly 9,000 words. And in reference, the revised tradition books were generally between 50 and 65,000 words. So literally 5 to 7 times larger, depending on how you interpreted it. And I imagine almost all the authors, we were given X words plus 10% just in case. Yes. And I think we probably all submitted a submission that was 4,899 words. Pardon me, 9,899 words.
Yep. I got mine down to 98, but yeah.
Show off. So you wrote the Society of Ether.
Yes.
What do you like about the Society? Like, what about it resonates with you? And I guess before this book came out, where did you see the Society of Ether being in the M20 line? Like, what did you consider to be the state of play before you had the opportunity to start adding or maybe updating it?
So there's 2 questions in there, and first my own view of and kind of resonance or lack of resonance with the Etherites. I always loved them, and I loved them in the sense of familiarity and kinship, such that I was the only one that got to say bad things about them, in the same way that, like, no, I get to insult my family, you certainly do not. And part of that is, as an academic myself, I saw myself very much as being certainly not an Etherite, but I saw a lot of the methodological intersection and shared dynamics. So they were a tradition that I understood. They were not the tradition that I wanted to play. They were not the tradition that I wanted to write or read fiction about, but there was a very hesitant kinship there, which wasn't necessarily a comfortable one, because I'm very uncomfortable as an academic. I never wanted to be an academic. I hate being an academic, and I basically want to fist fight academics in the parking lot more often than get along with them. So my relationship to the Etherites was familial, but in the conflict rich sort of ways. Mm-hmm. And I didn't always agree with every portrayal of them in the various iterations, but I also loved that disagreement was there, because approaching, the scientists, you're supposed to have disagreement. You're supposed to debate and have rigorous. And I liked that they were never presented one-dimensionally or in a manner that had all of the answers. So they were presented in a way that at times self-contradicted extensively, even within a single text. And that of course got even wider as the editions went on. So I very much liked those things. In terms of the state of things in M20, ironically, I love the way that they are written into Mage 20. I love some of the updates and the distillations that are provided. And it left me so hungry for more, because I feel like a lot of missed opportunities were there, but also that then just invites engagement from other authors or from players and storytellers at individual tables, which is of course the point of so much of these. It's not supposed to be, I'm going to make a sports reference here and I suck at those. So it's not the slam dunk. The book is meant to be the layup, which then we, the consumers of it, then get the ball in our hands and it's our game. And I think Mage 20 did an extraordinary job of giving us the ball as players and readers.
Yeah, the goal of the core book is to load the bases so you can go on base and spike and get a touchdown. Yep. I think that's pretty apparent. So iSport's good too.
Yeah, I think we both did really well there.
No errors detected. So what do you feel were kind of those gaps that needed to be filled in M20? If there's anything that comes to mind where you're like, someone just reads M20 and they're like, oh, the Society of Aether, this seems pretty badass.
The thing that I walked away with when I read it, when Mage 20 first came out, or at least when I got my first edition of it, my first read through, the jarring emphasis on exclusively the steampunk dynamic, which I don't dislike, but it is so much a singular view. And the Society of Aether had, from its first iteration, it was as broad as any university in terms of its corpus of available studies and pursuits that any individual could have. You could almost have a game that was just Aetherites in terms of full complexity and even genre upending dynamics. And so the one thing I felt was what two concentrated pages that we're given in Mage 20 for the Aetherites just emphasized more of that one flavor and didn't as much emphasize some of the other stuff, although it did allude to them. And so I wanted to see more of the science, but not just the weird science, also the social sciences, the theoretical sciences. And I liked that it was no longer instantly dating itself with references to new and current today science fact, because those are going to be turned over in probably by the time that the book
in the 30-month window between this going to Kickstarter and being in people's paws. Certainly. So I think that's a good snapshot of maybe what we didn't quite have yet for M20. And of course, people can always fill in from previous editions. But it as a Mage player, I always die a little bit when someone's like, oh, I have this question from M20. And I'm like, the answer to that question came out 17 years prior in this second edition book, which is only available as a PDF. Or something like that. So we kind of get this idea that the Society of Aether is much more than the steampunk presentation, and quite simply, they didn't have space for too much more than that.
Absolutely.
So what do you feel are the biggest challenges that face the Society of Aether in the third decade of the 21st century? Like they as a group, what do you feel their biggest challenges are?
One of the themes that's run going all the way back to first edition has been the internal reckoning of times that they didn't get it, that as a tradition, they blundered stuff pretty badly, from straight up racial discrimination and so on. And I, definitely in going with some of what's addressed in both the M20 core and the Book of the Fallen, sort of setting wide, is emphasizing the fact that being mages, being amongst the awakened, does not mean that mistakes can't be made, power can't be misused, and so on. So I wanted to really allow for a continuation of the internal self-evaluation of the Aetherites, because that, again, in academia, that's what we're all supposed to be doing. In mundane, real-world academia, we do that. We are constantly updating our understanding of things, our ethics, our approaches, with the theme of Mage really being about power, and it's cliche, but power and the responsibility that comes with it, but then also how easy it is to fumble that, either indefinitely or for a time. I really like that the Aetherites were never presented in any of the editions of the game as being infallible science gods. And so going to your question of what are some of the biggest issues, well, the 21st century is defined by unprecedented misinformation campaigns and society in our real world dynamic, which of course most, especially modern set games, are meant to be some way reflective commentaries around. All of those things that we're seeing, from election hacks to mass hysteria and almost cult conditioning dynamics coming up globally right now in the 21st century over the last 2 decades, all of that's rooted in behavioral science. All of those things are science. It's not arbitrary. It's not accidental. It's not random happenstance and random mass hysteria. It's orchestrated and rooted in what is understood and studied from about 150 to 200 years of studying human behavior and social theories and sciences. So I wanted to bring that element up, which had already been alluded to around the Aetherites in Mage 20, their involvement through the 20th century with things like the film industry and fandoms. And so I wanted to emphasize that those areas and trending behavior is itself part of what is studied in the sciences in a major way. And so we are living in the 21st century now, IRL, with unprecedented anti-intellectualism and the collapse of the trust in science, and as well as all the ways that science has been misused by those who knew enough of it to misuse it coercively and corruptively. So I wanted to have those themes brought in, and in a realistic way, not even terribly embellished, because it doesn't take much embellishment in the 21st century right now. But I wanted to just kind of ping the reminder that those areas are science as well. Science isn't just Breaking Bad and cooking meth and making super soldiers and time machines. It's also all of the disinformation campaigns and propaganda that can seize control over the consciousness of an entire nation.
Do you feel there are any internal threats to the Society of Aether?
Yep, I do. And while, of course, I know what was in my final draft as it is headed in for final reviews and all of those fun tweaks that happen in the publishing world, but I actually speak to some of the dynamics of, is it possible that the Society of Aether has been infiltrated? Those are some of the dynamics that were alluded to, especially toward the end of Revised. Is this a threat to the tradition internally? If so, how would they know? And then I also straight name the question of, I believe I frame it some way along the lines of course, most of the Aetherites, most of the scientists, the good scientists, would balk at the idea that they are in any way vulnerable to the corruption, to the nephandic touch, to what I refer to in the text as fallen ether, or at least that they're not any more vulnerable than any other tradition. But the other traditions aren't mad scientists building doom rays and having mountains made of Frankensteinian beasts that are made from scavenged parts of apex predators from around the world and brought together with a ancient artifact from the hollow. So yeah, the Aetherites, as with real world scientists, are prone to becoming so tunnel focused that they, in their pursuits, in their science, can be divorced from the orienting dynamics that are supposed to keep them on the proverbial straight and narrow. And so I did want to emphasize that, because I think that's been an element of how they've been approached since the first edition. And I wanted to make sure to not lose that.
Yeah, the statement you have, again, all of these lines may be ultimately cut in our chapters may be completely gone by the time this gets out there. But you have the line, the truth is science demanding hyperfocus has a dark side, and without the orientation of the Kitab Al-Asir's philosophies, Aetherites are more susceptible to the nephandic corruption than anyone would ever care to admit. And it's just, your submission oozes with those well-wrought lines that summarize what has come in the preceding paragraph. And as someone who needed to read this very quickly, I appreciate that.
Thank you. That's an element that I wanted to also, thank you for reading that particular line, because throughout the writing, I wanted to also not lose that they're also a grimoire tradition that comes out of the Hermetics.
Yes, there's a refocus on the Kitab and its importance, which is kind of fascinating.
One of the things that I find very interesting when sciencey stuff, as a scientist myself, when sciencey stuff is addressed in writing by people who are fiction writers or gaming writers and don't have a firm background in the sciences, they frequently don't understand, or at least if they do, it's not reflected in the general approach. Our sciences come out of our philosophies. The classical philosophical process is the core methodology that gives us the ability to have a scientific method and approach. And so I definitely wanted to lean into that, because it's one of, again, the real world issues facing the sciences today, is this sense of science as the ultimate answer. And that is something that is actually corrupting the sciences today, because it's losing sight of the responsibility of that internal navigation and orienting dynamics. So the grimoire tradition and classical philosophical tradition that they come out of as a tradition, as the Aetherites come and emerge into the modern science age, that is their compass. That's the thing that they need to continue to go back to, or it's all death rays.
That's death rays all the way down.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the statement that you have is pretty fascinating, and this will lead into my next question. How have the relationships with the Society of Ether and the technocracy changed as they face this common foe in the face of the masses resisting quote-unquote truth? But for the last decade, with consensus simultaneously catching up in technological areas and falling drastically behind in reason and regard for wonder, Etherites have taken more seriously their unorthodox approach to the science of utopia. And just the phrase science of utopia is an amazing line. How did you as an author choose to maybe revise, update, or comment on the relationship between the technocracy and kind of the tradition's most, in some way, scientific group?
I can summarize that, I think, in a line, although I likely worded it better in my text. You might be able to pull it up as I'm speaking, but in the section describing the relationships with other factions, I specifically state that the biggest issue with the technocracy is that their name is a lie. They're not a technocracy, they're a bureaucracy. They're not the rule of technology, they're not the rule of science, they're the rule of the desk, they're bureaucrats. And what they do is lock science and technology away in drawers. And that is the biggest issue of contention between the pure science of the Etherites who believe in science for everyone. And this is one of the lines that I loved from Mage 20. I think it originates in M20, but I could be misremembering that. But I definitely leaned into it and borrowed heavily from it throughout my writing of this, which is all or nothing as a general guiding ethos. I'm sorry, all or none. Science is for everybody. And it is not something that we have controlled experiments. Certainly we, the Etherites, we do things in a controlled, we build our death rays under controlled settings, Terry. But the idea is that this is for the elevation of all. The idea is that nobody is getting left back in the trenches. And that is, in many regards, the opposite methodological approach and goal of the technocracy, at least as I choose to perceive them as the writer of this chapter, because I needed to make the choice of how am I viewing the technocracy here? And it is they're the ones running the university, not the ones doing the science in the university. And I get that's not accurate or nuanced to the technocracy, especially as they evolved edition for edition. But that is the approach that I needed to limit myself to in 9,000 words.
Yeah, certainly. Was there a bit of lore that you got to add to the Society of Ether that pleased you, or maybe two?
Yeah. As a player and as a reader, one of my biggest complaints was in the earlier editions, missed opportunity with Tesla. And so if I had had more time, I would have done more with Tesla, but there was no way to do much with Tesla in the available space and still achieve the job that I set out to do with the chapter. Because I had wanted to, I did a lot more deep diving into Tesla's work and biography, including a poem that he wrote, which includes space ray guns and death rays and things like that. And it's a poem which is serving as a critical contemporary analysis and critique of then contemporary scientists and noteworthy theorists. And he dedicated it to his best friend and, per some scientific historians, his possible lover, a guy named Virak. And Virak is a real-world poet who lived and was jailed as a Nazi sympathizer, Nazi-involved bad guy and propagandist. And so since we've already included in Mage that Tesla is an Etherite, Virak is one of the sons of fallen ether per me. I wrote him in as close friend and confidant of Tesla's who went the other way. And so he done fell to corruption. And he brought the social sciences and the propagandist sciences of ether to the nephantic corruption that we see play out in World War II. And so I really like that because it weds the traditions more to some of the real world dynamics. A lot of those illusions are there, but I like to have at least some loose suturing of a game that's set in the real world where it ties it into some degrees of specificity. It also gives a threat. I allude to, while this is a figure who is presumed to have died at the time that he in real life did in fact die, I left it open like there are some rumors that he may still be around. So I wanted to give that story feed that there might, if not he himself, maybe some storytellers can run with the idea of those following in his tradition, following in his footsteps, because it speaks to the dynamics of applying ether science to the social manipulation and more the arts and psyops side of mass control and toward incredibly corrupted ends. So that was one of the things that I really enjoyed being able to find space for.
And it's good to know that Elias currently has Tesla's brain, along with a Tamagotchi and a Furby. So
Yes.
that's good to have him there. And something tells me that name may come up again. Was there anything about the tradition you were pleased to get rid of?
When I started out, I actually started to make a list, basically exactly like that. And then it left a sour taste in my mouth because I don't like, unless something has been done egregiously wrong by a past writer, like really offensively bad, I found I didn't like approaching the work that way, especially as someone who loves it. So instead of finding things that needed to be changed or fixed, I took the approach of choosing continuances from there that allowed for that to still be, especially, again, keeping in mind players and storytellers from the old guard who are still running with those dynamics there. So I instead found ways to introduce things that derive from stuff rather than trying to change or get rid of those things. I just made them not my focus. So I changed my lens of consideration. An example on that is I generated a new NPC. I created a new figure of note, and I made this character a child of two of the other prominent figures from the revised book. And I did that very consciously because I didn't think that, it's not that there was anything wrong with either of those characters in any major way. It's that I didn't think that they were going to necessarily land as well in 2021 as they had in 1998, whenever that book came out. And so instead of trying to change them or push the evolution of those characters to try and fix things that I thought maybe wouldn't land as well today, I just gave them a child, which they were in a relationship canonically. So, hey, babies. And then I got to take from both of those characters and express in a unique and new way through their child. And I had fun with that. But I found that that was an easier way of updating things than straight up striking anything, which I think is always easier. It's less speed bumps for both new players and old players alike who are coming either, if this is their first iteration of the game or they've been here again since 93, the less speed bumps, the better in most cases.
Is there a favorite character you got to add or expand on?
I really liked being able to bring in Elias. I'm excited. I geek out about him, and we were talking a little bit before we started here about him. I loved that I had the word count to fit him.
Mm-hmm. Who is Elias for the audience, please?
Sorry, yes. So Elias is an Aetherite who's introduced, I believe, for the first time in print in the original Sons of Aether book, then from 93, 94 when it came out, the cool foil covered one. And he is within the Mage canon. Elias is the historic basis for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. He is the real life creation of an Aetherite, and he is therefore a Promethean, a constructed being who awakened. And so far as I have been able to gloss from, I had to do deep dives through a bunch of World of Darkness books well outside of Mage as well to try and fact check myself. But so far as all the statements I have found indicate, he is the only Promethean to have awakened and receive an avatar, and no one really knows why it happened. And so I like that premise. And I think that very little was done with him after his inclusion in that book. He gets maybe a sentence or two mentioned in various places. I really like him and saw him especially being a character who emerges so strongly and vibrantly out of that first edition ethic and a lot of those elements from first edition that didn't carry over as strongly into revised or into Mage 20. It allowed for him to be a vessel for carrying those in and giving them a place in the setting for anyone that wants to run with that. So I had a lot of fun bringing him into the 21st century and elaborating on some of the threads that I believe were alluded to pretty directly in the treatments that he received earlier, but giving him a little bit more dimensionality, more dynamic, and a little bit more patina.
And Dr. Elias Waldman is a tank. So for those of you wondering what an Arete 8 near Archmaster with willpower 10 and something like 12 health levels, we now have our first Aetherite that could go up against a low-level Exalt. I was particularly fond of that. Also that they own a plutonium demon core as well as regularly carrying around both borax and formaldehyde, because if you can't cover a problem with one of those three things, I don't know what you're dealing with.
I liked him in again, quoting myself here, he's a character that I would love to encounter as a player in a Mage game. I allowed myself as the writer there to slip into player headspace and what would blow my hair back as a player to round the corner and encounter. And that was it. And so I tried to lean into that. I don't know what that says about me, but
It's also interesting because Mage is a setting to me disproportionately where you can have very powerful NPCs that also do not dictate the plot of the game necessarily because everyone has such different agendas. It is possible for you to have a Rite 8 master that has survived the Avatar Storm without it and not have it dominate the setting. And that makes it cool. It makes it very much a kind of a take or leave element, which I certainly appreciate when reading through something. What would you add if you had been given an extra few thousand words?
My very first draft, I have a bad habit of not tracking word count when I do my first pass. And I came in at around 32,000 words for my first pass. But that was everything I would want. I wrote a
storyteller vault. Yeah.
But that was with I don't outline. I do a couple of quick preliminary note card type of deals before going into a project. But then I just deep dive in. I wrote 3 times what I was supposed to. And no regrets on that. It wasn't wasted time at all. I enjoyed every minute of it. A few thousand words wouldn't give me enough room to do more of what I would like to have seen done. Actually, the one thing that I would probably have included is more on Tesla. That was the one thing that I think that my Tesla portions were the last thing to hit the chopping block. And I needed to. It was probably 1,800 words. And there was no way to move anything else around without it becoming a Tesla book. Those elements and inclusions in my kind of second to last pass felt superfluous, and which was upsetting to me because personally it's what I really wanted to have in there. But so if I had another 2,500 words, Tesla. It was one of the, I think, missed opportunities in earlier editions. But I'm not the reason I made the cut and made the call is I'm not sure how relevant it was to the 20 line. It didn't seem as salient today as it might have in 93 to 96.
Where would you like to see M20 go? If you were tapped to participate in another M20 project, what do you think you would like it to be?
That is a very good question. I almost wish that I were being asked that after having a time to read some of the books that are currently in queue to be released, because we've got a lot more coming out. We've got Victorian coming out, and I've gotten glimpses of some of that as a writer, as it was germane to what I was doing, but not enough to sink my teeth into it as a reader. And so I would like to suspend that and say that what I would like to see, because and this may be, again, something that says more about me as both a player and as a writer, but I like to see things loosely sutured together with at least the suggestion of cohesion. So I'd like to see cross-referential material with some of because I like it when settings feel like they have an internal trajectory. And they feel like you can become immersive in them. You can lose yourself in them rather than feeling like a setup or staged apartment that you're viewing as a potential renter. And I'm not saying that Mage 20 feels set up and staged. It certainly does not. In fact, more than probably any of this era of the game books, it feels very lived in and broken in and worn in. And I would like to see it continue to connect to the books that have been coming out. And I'd like to see those threads drawn together. For me, both as a player and as a storyteller, even if they're just cute little Easter eggs, I like that cross-referential stuff. It makes me feel that the stories I'm playing in or that I'm running or that I'm writing are connected to this shared woven tapestry that other people are also pulling on and yanking on, or sometimes running out the door with. And I like that. That's part of what makes the shared universe dynamic of these games so profound. This is going to sound weird, but there's a scene in Garden State with the guy from Scrubs in it.
Zach Braff.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of people hated that because they mistook it for another Cusack style emotional man baby lead character, but it was a story about mental health and systemic institutional abuse within the mental health industry. And it was a story about trauma, and it really captured those themes very well. But anyway, there's a scene in it where the lead character drives away from a gas station with the gas pump still in his car, and he doesn't realize it until he gets to his destination and the pump is still hanging out the side of his car. It sounds weird, but I love when that happens in shared universe multi-writer dynamics, because it speaks to the fact that in these things, canon and continuity aren't always going to be reliable, aren't always going to line up completely. Sometimes somebody is driven off with the gas pump still hooked into the side of their car. And it's up to other writers and players and storytellers to figure out, what the hell are we going to do with all of that? I like that. So what I would like to see from Mage 20 moving forward is more of that. I want to see gas pumps explode. I want to see people break shit. I want to see the threads of the sweater get pulled on. I want to see, that's the whole point of Mage, of course, is pulling on the threads and seeing where you can break it and where you can bend it in game. And I want to see that happen more, so that it continues to membrously move with the times in a manner that I think Mage uniquely has done, probably more than any of the other World of Darkness, the old World of Darkness games have done. And that's not to knock any of the other, I love all of the World of Darkness settings, but I think that Mage is uniquely adapted to that just by the base premise of reality manipulation as the kind of core concept. So I'd like to see us get maybe a little meta with that and continue that trend as writers. So if I were offered another gig and everybody doesn't hate me for what I've already done, I would definitely say yes. But in terms of what specifics I would want, I got to see what's coming out in. I hate that Onyx Path teases us with their release schedules and pending books and all of that, because I just want it now.
That is entirely reasonable. And if you take all of that cut material and turn it into a Storyteller Vault publication and you want to talk about that, I look forward to chatting with you about it. But otherwise,
absolutely.
Theanos, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Terry. Have a great day.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where our opening Wordle guess is always the adjective for having too much morbidity quiet, Jory. Our show is made possible by our executive producers, and they are Christopher Phillips, Oracle of People Named Mark, born in Peoria, Illinois since 1921. Buck Farmer, Oracle of Vinyl Reissues through the Smithsonian's Music Archive. And John Widener, Oracle of People who dye their hair blue and can really pull it off successfully. Additionally, our other executive producers are Alex S., Anders S., Anon, Berto, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris P., Dan Svensson, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsick, Elliot Osborne, Gargle Lenoir, George Lara, Guy Conan Stewart, Yibble, Isabel Castillo, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Carl Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Mike Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nabero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Rob H., Ryan Hilton, Ryan Kendi, Sam Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, W. Starter, and Zach Rules. Our EP shoutout is to Carl Halperin, whose name contains the word hail. Most people don't know this, but hail is formed when a cloud has a pore that isn't properly cleaned and ice and dust accumulate. Eventually, the cloud pore may get aggravated enough that the cloud joins a cold front to try and freeze it off, expelling the stone from its cloud skin. Clouds are often jealous, and all nearby clouds will similarly tear off their exfoliating patches so that no cloud can claim credit, causing a hailstorm. Remember, prevent hail, use a periodic scrub, but avoid microbeads. That can cause quiet. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye!